I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the January 2019 Food Safety Panel meeting. I'm Clay Rogers, and I'm an Assistant Executive Officer at the Central Valley Water Board. And you're going to have to deal with me as the moderator today, because the moderator that we had under contract, unfortunately, is no longer under contract with the state board, so he's not available to us. So I'm going to fill in. So there'll be no review of my performance at the end. But anyway. No formal review, let's put it that way. I'll go a little bit out of order, and we'll do the introductions first before we do the agenda review. So I'll let the food safety panel members that are present here in person, and then the ones on the phone, introduce themselves.
Seth Shonkoff, Executive Director of PSE and at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab.
Barbara Peterson from Exponent.
Andy Gordis, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fresno.
Do we have panel members on the phone? I know Ken, and I believe somebody else was on the phone also.
Yes, this is Ken Clark from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment.
And this is Gabrielle Ludwig with the Almond Board of California.
Great. And then we'll go with staff. I already introduced myself. RJ, you want to?
RJ Salcido with the Water Board.
Carl Longley, Central Valley Regional Water Board.
Rebecca Asami, Central Valley Water Board.
Josh Mahoney, Central Valley Water Board.
Dale Harvey, Central Valley Water Board.
Dr. Stringfellow.
Will Stringfellow, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, serving as science advisor to the board.
And how about GSI folks? So that was Rob Schofield and Bernie Beckerman from GSI. I'll just repeat that since we're being webcast, so I'll need people to speak into the microphone just for that. I'll probably go ahead and skip introductions of people in the audience. If you have questions, you please introduce yourself at that time so we can mark it down for the record. We'll go ahead and do agenda review. Also, I'll do just a couple formality, hospitality issues. The restroom is right out this door and the first left if you need to use it. I'm not sure whether or not we'll take a specific break halfway through the morning or not. I kind of doubt that we're going to go all the way to 3 o'clock, but you know, we'll see how long it goes, and as far as a lunch break, we'll make that decision when we get close to lunch. If we're close to being done, I'd probably suggest that we go ahead and finish rather than take a lunch break and come back for a half hour or 45 minutes, and we'll just go ahead and knock it out. If for some reason there is an emergency, please just follow the exit signs and exit the way you came in. Take down till you hit the wall, make a left, and outside, and we'll gather in the parking lot. Highly unlikely that would be the case, but I just want to mention it just in case we end up in that situation. As far, we'll do the agenda review, but I also want to mention, you know, this is primarily a public meeting of the panel. It's for the panel's input, for us to present information. We will take questions from the audience and from folks on the phone via email. But we'll do that, we'll address those questions at the end of each item in the agenda. So I think there were copies of the agenda out there available for everybody. So if you didn't get one, please find one, or staff will help you find one. And so I'll ask the panel and GSI and Will, as far as the agenda, we're basically done with the introduction except for the agenda review, so we'll do that. But when you take a look at that, are there other items that we need to include in the agenda that you would like to see? Hearing none, we'll proceed with the agenda as it is. So we'll go through review of the past meetings. I think we sent out to all the panel members our summary notes for the July 25th public meeting. I thought we sent them out also for the meetings of just the panel too, but I don't have those specific dates. I believe there were 2 meetings. Rebecca, you got the dates?
There were 2 roundtable meetings last fall, one in September and one in November.
So we have the draft summary notes for that, so hopefully the panel members have had a chance to review them, and if there's any corrections or comments that you want to add here, or if they're a little bit longer, if you want to send those to us, we will certainly incorporate those in the final ones and get them up on our webpage, on the food safety webpage for the Central Valley Water Board, so they're available to the public.
Do we want to set a date by which we get comments to make corrections, and then after that we'll post them, kind of thing?
What would you suggest, Dale?
I would say 2 weeks.
Okay.
Because we distributed them a week or 2 ago, I believe, so I haven't got any comments back. So.
We'll go ahead and go 2 weeks for any review or comments. If you haven't had a chance to look at those, or if your comments are a little more extensive than perhaps we want to talk about here today. And then we'll put them up for, we'll finalize those and put them up on the web page for everybody to take a look at. And certainly we always appreciate any comments or thoughts from members of the public. As far as fruit sampling, we'll go through this one pretty fast because I think item number 4 is going to be the long one today. Certainly, we completed all the planned fruit sampling for 2018. Those results are coming in and have been coming in. We're still analyzing that data and having to go back and coordinate between what are the treated samples, the samples that were, basically those are samples from fields that were irrigated with produced water, and the control samples, which is the fruit and nuts that were picked from cropland that did not receive produced water. So that's the control and the treated, so that we have the 2 samples to see if there's any difference in the concentrations between the 2 groups of the selected constituents. Certainly, we're not planning to have extensive of sampling in 2019 as we did in 2018. As the panel, we have the 2 years of data. We're looking at sampling 3 crops at this time that we know were not sampled last year. Those are cherries and blueberries that are grown in very small acreage within the area down there, but there are some that We happened to miss the harvest last year, and so we're going to go ahead and pick those up. We're also working on potentially citrus samples because there was an expansion in the list of constituents since the citrus samples were collected last year, since they come off in the winter. And we expanded the list of constituents for the other crops, and so you know, I think we're going to be sampling citrus to get that expanded list. But the thought is that, and Will can add to this, and GSI too, is that, you know, we've done a significant amount of sampling. We haven't seen anything to date that causes us, you know, there's not a wow moment that says, oh, there's a big problem here that is the issue. We need to finish task 1, task 2, and finish that work that was the literature review and the assessment of the chemicals and the toxicity of the individual chemicals. Put the white paper together to document our results and where we are with the recommendations that would tell us what, if any, additional work needs to be done, or if there's some type of routine work that should be performed associated with this. So I think that's pretty much where we are with the fruit sampling, and I would ask that, you know, if the panel members have any questions, comments, and I would invite those at this time.
Last year you mentioned you missed the potato crop. I mean, are there other kind of rare type crops for 2019, like potatoes, carrots, or garlic?
Yeah, we're working on that now, and certainly if there's something that's grown that we haven't seen before, we would want to sample that. The root crops, you know, or you know, if there were any types of vegetables or things of that nature, you know, then that's a specific, those are specific crops that we would want to discuss. I'd probably have those conversations with Dr. Stringfellow and GSI to assess, and then we would probably interact via email at least with the panel, or have a phone call to discuss, you know, whether any of those things need to be sampled. There were some issues with the potato sampling last year, and so if there are potatoes grown this year, that is another crop that we would look at sampling. Right now, you know, we were not aware of the blueberries and cherries last year, even though they're, you know, cherries are a permanent crop. Blueberries are grown on kind of a small vine that go for several years between plantings. Not like a tree. They're not as long duration, but we didn't find out about those till after they were already harvested and the fruit was gone. So we made a point that we want to pick those up and make sure that we get samples of those. Good control samples may be an issue with some of these crops, though, because, you know, there are very limited acreages of cherries in Kern County. Matter of fact, this like 20-acre field that we have may be like the only cherries in Kern County. So it raises some questions when we're hopping to completely different soil types and potentially different types of farming practices, you know, how suitable the control samples will be to compare with the treated samples, but those are some of the complexities that we're trying to work out. I think we will, you know, and certainly I would invite the panel to weigh in on this. We still need to try and get some control samples, you know, get them as close as we can that appear to be similar conditions, but particularly when we're outside of the water districts that are using the water, access is always an issue for us because we don't have the authority to require somebody to let us in. So we have to go get permission from folks to let us in to sample the control sites, you know, and if we're dealing with completely different farming organizations, so far we've been able in lots of cases, the control sites and the treated sites are owned by the same farmers. They're big enough farmers, they have lands both within the area using produced water and the area not using produced water, which also helps to make sure that the management practices and the farming practices are fairly consistent so that we don't introduce that variable into the system, or try to at least minimize it as much as possible. But those are issues we'll be looking at and work our way through those as we go through the year. So, like I said, any other questions? Andy, did that answer your question? Any questions from the panel members on the phone? Okay, and then I'll ask, Dr. Stringfellow, GSI, you have anything you want to add to that? And then I'll ask any members of the public if they would like to address the panel, if they have any questions that we can answer. Please introduce yourself. And
Hi, I'm Robert Gore from the Gualco Group. I represent several agriculture and irrigation district clients, and just as a matter of background, there are more than 400 commodities grown in California versus 10 to 20 in other states. California has more than 200 orders of soil, and as you noted, Mr. Rogers, the farming practices vary from till to no-till to there's all kinds of others. The variables are immense, just as a matter of fact. That's
thank you. Any other questions? Did Rebecca, did we receive any emailed questions regarding this item? Okay, well then I guess we'll move on to item number 4, which is the memorandum of understanding. For those of you, I assume most everybody knows, but I'll go ahead and repeat it, try to be brief. There is a memorandum of understanding between the water boards and the producers and users of the produced water, basically that agrees that they're going to do certain things. The fruit sampling is part of that. That falls under task 3 of that memorandum of understanding. And then task 1, GSI is going to make a presentation, and that's the review of toxicity issues. And I'll go ahead and let Dr. Bernie Beckerman and Dr. Rob Schofield from GSI come up and talk to the panel about their work.
Great, thank you. We just wanted to give you an update as to where we were with task 1. I'm going to briefly outline each of the tasks that we've been asked to assist with, but this presentation sort of comes on the heels of a draft report we just submitted to the water board, which they're reviewing. So, as Clay was mentioning, we've been asked to do and get involved in 3 tasks. One was the selection of the chemicals of interest based off of known additives and naturally occurring chemicals in produced water. The second was to conduct a literature review on chemicals we identified that were of particular interest. And the third was sampling, getting involved with sampling of the crops. and doing chemical analyses of these based off of what we know is in produced water. So, like I said, we have just submitted a report to the Water Board focused on our activities for Task 1, and that's what I'm going to be presenting today. There we go. All right, so before we started, I wanted to talk a little bit about and describe sort of the process. The processes are the model that we considered for produced water. On the left-hand side of this image, you can see in the upper left-hand side, we have those factors which affect produced water. The lower are the other sources of water, which we won't be discussing here. So in produced water, we have the water that's in the ground plus any of the hydrocarbons and inorganics that may be a result of the underlying geology, and then these additives. These are mixed, again, with other water sources, which may be contaminated with agricultural chemicals. And then there is potential processes that happen between when these are first put together and when they're finally distributed to the agricultural fields. And so these fate and transport issues look at things like degradation, transformation, and potential persistence. And we've started to address some of these in our assessment of these chemicals. And so the first step of this was to look at what was in produced water. And so there are additives and naturally occurring chemicals. And from the Water Board, we received a list of 377 sort of data entries in this database. And after reviewing them, we found 306 unique chemicals. There was a lot of duplicates, things like D-limonene, citrus terpenes, other chemicals that sort of had the same name or slightly different names, but same CAS numbers. And then we saw a little bit of overlap with naturally occurring chemicals. This sort of brings us into what we've identified from a review of the literature. And we found 49 organic chemicals and 46 inorganic constituents. And these include radioactive, like naturally occurring radioactive compounds such as radium and uranium, but they are very small components of the mix. We have a total of 385 chemicals we've evaluated. So when we first started the evaluation, there were 13 factors which we tried to assess as to their utility in this assessment. After reviewing these factors based off of the available data and our goal of assessing their toxicity with relation to ingestion of the crops, we settled on this group of these four factors. One was non-cancer oral toxicity. The other was carcinogenicity, developmental reproductive effects, and this fate and transport, environmental persistence, degradation. So we took a systematic approach in assessing these chemicals. The first was to identify chronic toxicity values that were published. The second was to identify those chemicals which had been deemed not to be toxic, whether through the FDA or they're used as food additives. And then from those, we identified chemicals that had no information at all. And what was left were a couple of sublists, and I'm going to talk about each of those in more detail. So from the 385 chemicals, we identified 128 with published toxicity values. On the left-hand side of this little graphic, we can see that there were 21 that were generally regarded as safe, and that's a FDA definition. We found 46 to be virtually non-toxic, given the concentrations we might expect to see in produced water. 65 of them were not chronically toxic. based off of the scientific literature, given sort of repeated dose chronic exposures. We identified 62 that are going to require some further evaluation, again, for a number of reasons we're going to discuss later. 11, so we weren't able to make any definitive conclusions on. There were 5, as I mentioned before, some radionuclides. 3 of them are naturally occurring. There are 2 of them that are used as tracers, and they're used in very small quantities. And then GSI had derived 43 toxicity values based on the available animal literature. So for the published toxicity values, we looked through state, federal, published values through EPA, OEHA, USGS, and through the CDC. And from that, we had 128 that we were able to assess through from the list. Like I mentioned before, the generally regarded as safe list, which is where FDA has designated them as being, because they're used as food additives, and then other ones which are sort of either food additives, maybe not on this list, health supplements, are virtually non-toxic, inert, or break down into inert products. And from that, we have 66 chemicals. Now, for chemicals that we've identified as not showing evidence of chronic toxicity, these are things like ethoxylated alcohols, triterpenes, and polyacrylamide. Now, while ethoxylated alcohol acutely may be toxic, there's no evidence that at levels that we're likely to see that they're going to be toxic in either crops or produced water. And so to do this, we identified studies where they gave animals doses in the range of 500, or like hundreds, normally 500 up to thousands of milligrams per kilo, which is a relatively high dose for animal studies. And in none of the groups, there were any adverse effects observed. And in some cases, we saw sort of non-toxicologically relevant effects, things like forced stomach, irritation, which is not a structure that you see in humans, only in rats. And again, another rat-specific outcome, which would be alpha-2 globulin nephropathy, and that's even more specific just to male rats. From this process, we identified 65 chemicals that don't have evidence of chronic toxicity at levels expected in produced water. And so, as I said before, there were 11 of these chemicals which we were not able to make any definitive conclusion. Sometimes they were suggestive, but there was insufficient studies to make the determination, like acrolein dimer, where there's some indication of chronic toxicity, but it's a lot lower than its monomer acrolein. We had issues of sort of ambiguous definitions, where there was no CAS number and we were given sort of broad groups of chemicals, like aromatic amines and sorbitan esters, or where there was conflicting or incomplete data. An example here of quinaldine, where the toxicity is very low, but in bacterial assays, there's some suggestion of mutagenicity, but it's conflicting. And this might require some additional research in the literature review. So we identified 62 chemicals where we couldn't really assess their chronic oral toxicity based either on the toxicologic data, using read-across chemicals, so chemicals that are similar in structure, or we found them studies where they only looked at acute studies. We had missing oral data, or more oral exposure data, and there was no root-to-root extrapolation possible. So we couldn't take results from, say, a dermal exposure or an inhalation exposure study and translate it to an oral exposure for a number of reasons that relate normally to metabolism. And these are mostly groups of surfactants and copolymers that are used for a number of purposes like dewatering and mixing. So what was left were this group of 43 chemicals where we were able to identify animal data. From those, there was only non-cancer outcomes that were assessed. And I'm going to go through a little bit in how we evaluated the toxicity. So for those chemicals, we developed toxicity values similar to a reference dose. And this is a toxicity value where if you were exposed to it for a lifetime, you wouldn't expect an adverse outcome. It's an approach that's employed as a pretty standard approach by government agencies to evaluate toxicity in these chemicals. And the process takes a couple of steps. The first is to identify the study that's appropriate. So we need to find a toxicologically relevant outcome. If we found multiple studies, we would use the most sensitive. And in some cases, what would happen is that the study would find effects at all exposure levels. And this is considered the lowest observed effect level. And we deal with that in the way of dealing with the uncertainties, which is how we calculated the reference dose, which is the no observed adverse effect level, or this low L, the lowest observed adverse effect level, divided by some product of uncertainty factors. And so there were a total of 6 uncertainty factors which could be included. The first was scaling animal results to human results, and this is known as allometric scaling. This has to do with how the size of an animal affects the metabolism, excretion of chemicals. And while the standard method may be to apply a factor of 10, because not only were we trying to identify a level that was safe, we wanted to be able to equally compare these estimates between each other. And so we specifically used values published by the FDA that are meant to scale those doses based off of the size of the animal in comparison to humans. If we found that there were other metabolic differences between animals and humans, we could add an additional factor. Across the board, we added a value, an additional uncertainty of 10 to assess susceptible populations. When the studies were subchronic, so normally between 90 and 100 days, or 180 days, we added an additional factor of 10. If the study found effects at all doses, so we would take the lowest observed dose and divide it by another factor of 10. And if there were any study quality issues, such as only a few number of animals used, or the methods weren't well described in the paper, we could add an additional factor based off of that, which was between 1 and 10. So from this, we were able to develop toxicity values, which you see on the right-hand side. We've reported cancer risks that are based off of oral slope factors as a risk of 1 in 100,000. We're not reporting the 1 in 100,000 risk as being the safe risk, but it is the risk level that's reported by under Proposition 65 as the warning level, and provided and provides a good reference value to compare against the other reference doses. Now, I wanted to, there we go. I wanted to show one of the activities that we're going to do with these reference doses. And the first is to develop screening levels for the crops that that we're sampling for. Now, what I've reported here are 90th percentile consumptions, so relatively high consumption rates for a number of the crops that have been sampled. We can see things like citrus, you're eating almost half a pound of citrus a day, where things like garlic, you're eating 1.5 grams or 2 grams of garlic a day. And so what we're able to do from this is then develop produce-specific screening concentrations. And so based on the consumption and the toxicity values, what's reported in the table are concentrations of the chemicals that would have to be present in these foods to reach that toxic dose or that toxicity value dose. Yes.
Just a quick question for clarification: is this dry weight or is this?
No, this is just produce
Okay.
weight. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And what I presented here are the maximum concentrations that we've measured in the treated produce. Now, I want to note that these concentrations are not any different than the concentrations that we've seen in the control group, but I thought it important that we present what we've seen in the treated groups. And so I wanted to present basically a range of sort of consumption patterns and different kinds of food. What we have is citrus, relatively high consumption rate, garlic, it's a root crop at a very low consumption rate, and then we have a couple of different nuts. And so when we take this data and we compare it against the screening concentration, we develop what would be considered a hazard quotient or a hazard index. And values greater than 1 would suggest that we're above that reference dose. Values lower than 1 are below. And in all cases here, we have values that don't suggest that we're above sort of a safe level. If you remember earlier, I talked a little bit about fate and transport. So this is the degradation, transformation, and potential persistence of these chemicals in the environment and how it may affect the quality of produced water. So GSI has started to compile data on the degradability in water and in soil. These are based off of wastewater tests where bacterial inoculum is added to the media, and the media is then allowed to sit and degrade and measured after some length of time for the concentration of these chemicals. We have some uncertainty about how to translate this because they're unnaturally enriched. And so we're currently working on trying to translate and use this information in a way that's sort of helpful in the irrigation setting. We have the other uncertainty, especially with soil, that during fruiting, water is taken up very quickly. So at maximum rates, say in tomatoes, at 100 milliliters per hour or 800 milliliters per day, there may not be sufficient time for these chemicals to degrade in soil, which means that any of the data related to the biodegradability in soil sort of is not particularly helpful in making the assessment. And this is also compounded by the fact that a lot of these chemicals have varying degrees of absorption capability to the organic component of soil. So our ongoing work is looking to translate these fate and transport issues into the irrigation, basically the irrigation setting. And these uncertainties sort of focused us towards not necessarily taking a systematic approach and naively applying some cutoff values. but focusing the assessment specifically on the most toxic chemicals and looking at each chemical individually to assess whether or not any of these fate and transport mechanisms may affect the ultimate fate of these chemicals in the plants. So the question is, how do we get to task 2 from here, and where are we going from here? Like I said, we're focusing on the most toxic of the chemicals. There are a couple of pieces of information we need to sort of make our final assessments, and this has to do a little bit with what are the timelines and processes related to produced water as the produced water is extracted from the oil field and then finally delivered to the crops. And this is, as I mentioned before, going to require sort of a chemical by chemical assessment. And this will lead us to task 2, where we've been asked to sort of review the literature on produced water in agriculture, other sources of these chemicals, and the ambient levels in both water and in food. A more in-depth discussion of the chemicals' toxicities and how we got to those assessments that I presented earlier. Some of the specific fate and transport issues related to the list of chemicals, the available literature on plant uptake for them, though it is rather limited, and addressing that list of 61 chemicals which required further evaluation due to the lack of toxicity data. Thank you.
Do we have questions from the panel?
Barbara Peterson. Just pretty impressive overview. Thank you. I do have the question of, I believe the list of chemicals you're talking about are really what are either being used or coming with the water as it leaves the well. When we toured the plant, there were 2 treatment processes, maybe 3 if you count the walnut shells. Are those somehow helpful in the analysis to look at what those are designed to take out of the, what types of chemicals or what chemical properties are removed in those processes?
I mean, I think that's part of maybe where our knowledge gap is that we don't totally understand that at this point. I know things like walnut shells are definitely, like some of those chemicals that are used are included on those additive lists. But without a complete understanding of the process from field to field, I think it's going to be difficult to make an assessment of like what we can just remove from consideration. And so we've sort of taken a very conservative approach, and if it's on the list, it's getting assessed. Yeah.
Can I add to that? That is part of the next step. So what we're looking at is, we realized we can't just use a straight KOC cutoff. We can't use a hydrolysis. There isn't a specific value of those fate and transport factors that we can use to throw things out yet. So we've looked at the list. Here's what we're finding in the produce. And now we're going to go back and say, okay, is there a good reason why, particularly on the most toxic ones, is there a good reason why we're not finding them? So one of the things we're doing is we're scheduling a tour so we go down, because we realize that based on the discussions with the people who are familiar with the process, that there's a lot of variability in the time. Like in the summer, the water is going to move quicker. It's going to be used for irrigation, whereas in the winter, it might go into the ground first. It's not going to be used as fast. So that makes it difficult to say take the hydrolysis or the treatment process itself. So all of those factors, we are going to be looking at those to say, to rationalize the results that we're finding and to say, well, we don't expect to find, and we're going to be looking at the water data more carefully as well to say, well, are we finding it in the water? Why not? Well, it looks like it comes out in the treatment, or it looks like it hydrolyzes. So find some reason why we think it's we're not finding it, why it's not at the levels that we've calculated would be dangerous.
That would be my thought before you get into the fate and transport. If it's somehow eliminated earlier, that would make it, particularly like the ones where you have no toxicity data, that might be helpful as well.
Yeah, that's right. It would be good to get if we've got like treatment efficacy. So that's one of the things we're talking about going to do a tour of the treatment with the produced water treatment. See if we can get some of that information.
Thanks, Bernie. This is helpful. So I just want to sort of dovetail off of this last conversation about water and the types of chemicals that may still be in it by the time it gets sent down the canal for irrigation. So on the panel, and I believe some of this is captured in the notes from our last sort of roundtable meeting, there's been some sort of change in thinking about how it would be easiest and most scientifically rigorous to identify which compounds of interest might be in produced water, and it's probably not, testing fruit. And I think that most people agree with that. I'll just speak for myself. Some of the reasons why this might be more helpful is because, in the end, while it's really important to look at individual chemicals, it's also really important to, A, look at chemicals that are actually present, B, look at synergistic byproducts and daughter products, and C, we're never going to be able to understand chemical by chemical produced water matrices, and they're so variable. I just wanted to put that out there and see if you guys are sort of thinking about how to incorporate some of that into the second task here around literature review.
Yeah, we've been giving that a lot of thought. And at first I was very skeptical or not very skeptical, but somewhat skeptical about the value of the produce sampling. But now that we've gone through it and now that we've thought through it, I realize if we were just doing, well, what comes out on the treatment, what's the hydrolysis as it gets distributed, when it gets mixed, does it get diluted enough, when it goes to the soil, does it just attach to the soil and never gets up there into the plant, what's the plant uptake, what's the distribution in the plant parts. We just don't know each of those processes with enough detail and chemical specificity, and there's all the variables in the way people farm. There isn't any way we could have just predicted concentrations or even the presence in the fruit. So I'm really glad that we've got all that data that we do on, well, what's the level in the fruit, what's the level that would be dangerous. And now we're kind of working our way backwards to, well, did we find it in the water? And if we find it in the say in the irrigation water, then now our question is, well, does it have such a high KOC, or does it absorb the soil so tightly that it's in the soil but it doesn't get in the fruit, or it gets in the plant but it doesn't get to the orange? So we're kind of working our way backwards. Does it make sense? And then the ranking of the toxicity, we're putting our most effort into, well, those things that are toxic, what's the likelihood of those getting to the plant? And there'll be somewhere we just don't know that much about. I think the polymers are kind of driving us crazy now, but we think it's probably really doesn't have a chance of getting into the produce. We don't know that much about the fate and transport of it, but I think we'll come to some sense and some comfort that will show everybody that here's why we don't think it's there. There's why it makes sense. But it's going to be a non-systematic integration of all those factors, all those 13 factors that were up there that you're talking about. Well, and I think the water data is going to be very helpful.
And this is maybe a question for Clay and others. I know there's also been some thinking around, when samples of the produced water are taken, that there would be split samples that could be shared with, researchers, perhaps the panel, perhaps GSI, to do more extensive analysis, which I think would be very helpful for getting quickly to the bottom of a lot of these issues. And actually, if there are no problems observed in the produced water, you know, we can get really fancy and look at fate and transport and all of that. But ultimately, you know, doing a bang-up job looking directly at the water independently might be a quick way to move through at least the water coming from these fields at this particular time, not necessarily with external validity to other fields and other times.
Yeah, I can respond a little bit to that, and maybe Dr. Stringfellow would like to respond also. But, you know, I think those are all potential issues that are under consideration as we go through. You know, I think our task in front of us right now is to complete the 2 tasks that are, you know, in the fruit sampling and put the white paper together, and then the white paper would include conclusions and recommendations of the panel, you know, about what, if any, additional studies need to be done and how we move forward and do that. So I think that's probably the vehicle that I would look at right now, although, of course, I might look at Dr. Longley, also our board chair, and ask him if he has some input on that. But that would be my thought, is that those are all recommendations and conclusions that we would put in and justify within the white paper. And then if specific studies are needed, they would be performed after that.
I basically concur with you, Clay. The white paper is, we have, I think, done a fairly decent job of outlining what we expect in it, and we need to get it out and move on to the next step. And the white paper should in fact be an important vehicle as we do move forward in pointing out what we have to do next. We're never going to develop, at least in the lifetime of most in this room, everything we need to know about this topic. And but we need to learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can, and I think the white paper serves one step as we go through the multiple steps that are necessary.
This is Ken Clark. Can I jump in?
Yes, Ken.
I had a comment, small comment on the exposure calculation in the GSI presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that you're using the 90th percentile of the population fruit and vegetable consumption quantities.
Yes.
And I was a little concerned that you might be missing people who have vegetarian diets and might be consuming more fruit and vegetables on a daily basis. So I'd recommend a higher percentile, or maybe even doing a separate calculation for high-level consumers of fruit and vegetables.
This is Barbara. I think those were just kind of placeholders there to give us an idea. I have gone back to NHANES, and a little bit later we'll talk about that data, and we can talk about what values we might want to use.
That sounds good.
And if I can add something to it too, I think expand on your point that they're placeholders. It gives us a reference point, and same with some of the animal data, we can look and say, oh, okay, here it is. Here's the ratio of what would be safe versus what we're finding for the 90th percentile person. Most of those values come out to say even if somebody ate 10 times more or 100 times more, they would still be okay. So this gives us not a bright line that we can't cross, but it gives us a point of reference, and then we can go back and ask about what about those people who eat more, for example. These aren't interpreted, and these aren't intended to be interpreted as absolute bright lines.
Yeah, order of magnitude, really.
Hi, Will Stringfellow. I just wanted to add something to the conversation about, before we completely move on from the treatment and the water sampling. And we've discussed it a couple of times, and I think would be worth probably following up at this point. There is more data available on the treatment systems and water quality monitoring that's done by, I know particularly Chevron, but probably other companies as well, on their discharges. And it might, I wouldn't say it might, it would be useful to ask them to consider sharing that data. I know they do some continuing monitoring, and I think this data would be potentially useful to us to answer a few of the data gaps going towards the task 2, which is looking at getting, it gives us some indication of the mass flows, which is kind of a big data gap for us, and some other information on what are the processes that they're using and how efficient those processes are. I think it would help fill some of the data gaps. And I think it's something we could do now rather than necessarily waiting for the next step. I mean, it could be at least get a start on that, and I'm 90% sure it would be useful for closing some of our data gaps.
Another approach for filling some of these treatment data gaps, and I don't want to offer up some of your research, Will, without you promoting it yourself, but you know, there is a series of papers out there, some of which are co-authored by Dr. Stringfellow, that use basic assumptions about molecular structure and other attributes of individual compounds and compare it against the specifications of various treatment technologies that may also be useful.
And since you brought it up, if I may add that I'm not in 100% agreement with some of their statements about the not being able to interpret the biodegradation tests and or how you would interpret it. And we've just started that conversation. We just met about these results last week. But I think there is a lot we can add in terms of predictive biodegradation. And also we have a lot of experience personally and people I work with on how do you go from an OECD type degradation test into an environmental fate analysis. So I think we can help fill in the gaps there and provide some guidance.
That would be great.
Any other questions from the panel? Anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Stringfellow?
No, but as we discussed, and it'll come out in the reports, I think going back to basics and really, you know, completing the work of the panel and starting to refocus again on the water characterization is going to lead to a very good outcome.
Dr. Shonkoff.
Just one more sort of point on the importance of deeper analysis of water. You know, most of these chemicals that have been assessed and that have been disclosed are, you know, again, they're not going to stay those chemicals after being put under situations of high heat and pressure, mixed with hydrocarbons, put through oil water separators, run through walnut shells, exposed to the air, etc. There's a growing body of literature that's actually focused on tracking individual chemical additives like glutaraldehyde in oil and gas systems, and a number of these studies have shown that, you know, they readily degrade to daughter products, some of which have increased toxicity, some of which have unknown toxicity, some of which have less toxicity. So I just want to re-emphasize that point because I think that we don't want to be in a situation where we're looking at chemicals that actually don't end up existing because of all of these different processes. And I know that really pushes against the limits of toxicology as a field, and it's very complicated, but that's also one of the reasons why gaining access to produced water running it through things like GC mass spec and looking for peaks, looking for things that should be looked at, and doing whole effluent testing to cap it off might be some things to consider.
Too. One of the things that we're working with an analytical chemist who's very familiar with the chemicals in the oil industry, and I've asked her to look at some of the lab reports we're getting on the produce to say, do we see any non-target peaks that should be of interest? And it's hard to identify all of them, but last time I think we were talking about maybe looking for some of the ticks, for example, and say, do we see patterns of things that we should be looking at more carefully? We might miss something, but we are going to look to see, is there anything jumping out at us in those chromatograms.
Any other questions or comments from the panel, either here or Dr. Ludwig or Dr. Klock on the phone?
I have nothing more.
Nothing here, thank you.
With that, I'll go ahead and open it up and ask any members of the audience if they have questions or comments they would like to make.
Morning, Bill Alio with Environmental Working Group. First, I may have missed this, I apologize. Who is funding the work of GSI?
Yeah, I was thinking about making a clarification of that in that the GSI work said that they were under contract by the water boards. And that's not exactly true. The way the memorandum of understanding works is they are actually under contract from the coalition of users and producers of the water. Now, with that agreement and under that memorandum of understanding, that group has no input on the technical aspects of this work. I am the project manager for the water boards, and so all technical issues associated with this work run through me and our science advisor, Dr. Stringfellow, from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And so we basically serve as the technical folks that oversee the work because we wanted to have that separation from the producers, that they could not control the technical work that goes down, and then any changes in scope, anything like that, have to flow through us, and then we deal with the producers as far as funding, and they pay the bills, but they don't control the technical aspect of it. So the vast majority of their contact is directly with us, and matter of fact, our agreement is that they can't discuss technical issues with Coelho Water District and the other groups. It has to flow through us, and we will be involved in any of those discussions with Coelho.
Understood, thank you. And a tip of the hat to the producers and the users to fund this. This is great work. It's a really good, we're finally getting there, and it's a great start in getting good information. One thing I noticed, I'm not a toxicologist, but in looking at doses and toxicology, these days cutting edge is not high dose, but extremely low doses of chemicals like BPA, bisphenol A, for example. This question wasn't really unraveled until they did very low dose studies and found out there were estrogenic effects on rodents, and they've shown some on humans too. So giving high doses of BPA, well, you can't see anything. They did extremely low doses like you would get every day in diet and through dermal exposure, and they started finding out, oh, whoops, diabetes and obesity, all kinds of things were evident. So I always caution when I see these are high dose studies and toxicity. So we want to make sure we're going low and now very low dose too in terms of finding out chronic exposure.
Well, I mean, those were the kinds of studies that we did evaluate when we derived our toxicity values. Those studies which did not show chronic effect, a lot of them did come out as having low doses with no was no effect. I mean, they went up as high, when I said they went up as high as like hundreds to thousands of milligrams per kilo. So you would see doses in like 10 milligrams or lower, all the way up to 1,000 or 5,000 milligrams. So we're not looking at just the high dose regime, but also a very low dose regime.
Got it. Then a footnote on grass are generally recognized as safe. My understanding is, I'm using the best data you can have, but generally grass is what the industry or the manufacturer shows to the FDA to say, we think our product's safe. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not backed up by independent studies. So I always have that little asterisk with grass studies that say it's safe, and then 20 years later they go, whoops, it wasn't safe. So, but I know you're gathering data from a lot of sources, and I've looked at the various, how you're categorizing this to make some sense of a huge suite of chemicals, so I appreciate that, though. Thank you.
Any other questions from members of the audience? Rebecca, do we have any questions that were sent over the email?
Yes, we have one. So Deb Workman wrote in and she said, I would like to receive a copy of today's toxicity presentation. I would also like any associated reports provided to the regional board by GSI. Thank you.
Well, certainly all that information will be public. We'll load the presentations up on our webpage so that they can be viewed. And all the reports that are produced from this study will all become public information and will be available on our website for review by anybody that would like to do it. You know, it's just that as we move through those stages, you know, we're going to be open and transparent about the process, what we produce, what we do, so that everybody has the opportunity to review and comment on it.
Clay, about how long before this one's posted?
I would assume it'll be posted within the next couple days. Yeah, and as far as the report that was mentioned, and I think it was mentioned during the presentation, but I'll just add that it is currently being reviewed by staff and then will be sent out to the panel for review. And once we get those review and comments and incorporated, then that report will go up on the webpage and be available for review by members of the public. I don't have an exact time frame, I'll just add this, but I would expect that, you know, within the next week or two, that our staff and our science advisor will have the chance to review that. We'll have to send it out for at least a couple or 3 weeks for comment by the panel members to accommodate their schedules. So we're probably at least 6-8 weeks out before that'll be done, but my hope would be is that it is up on the webpage and available prior to our next public meeting. No other questions or no other emails? We'll move on to the crop information. I don't have a whole lot to add here, although Dr. Peterson had asked us to compare crop results with water quality data in one of our roundtable meetings. And so we are in the process of doing that. I just wanted to mention that. We don't have the specifics done because we need to do a little bit more analysis of the data. We have some data that looks like it's general ranges, but I think we're going to have to look at it in a little more detail, perhaps provide some statistical analysis of the results to see whether, the water quality is significantly different between different areas, and whether it's significantly, what kind of variability we get, how it's distributed. So that's going to take us a little while to complete. So unfortunately, we're not in a position that we have information to present or something we can discuss at this time. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Peterson and let her talk about consumption estimates that she's been working on.
It seemed like we're getting to the time now that we do have some residue information, some lists of chemicals, that it was time to be thinking about what food consumption data we would want to use and to compare. And the very question we got this morning is what percentiles. So what I'm presenting today are what I would think are the right choices. As you know, that is this for me to use? Okay. Okay. I do a lot of dietary exposure work, a lot of work with food consumption for nutrients, for chemicals, for pesticides, and for food additives. So to some extent, what you pick as the right endpoint depends on the toxicity of the compounds. We have kind of a balancing act here because presumably we have some things on the list that are more chronically toxic than some that may be shorter term. So I thought what would be most helpful is I went through and did the types of assessments that FDA would use for these types of chemicals and used their endpoints. These numbers are final in the sense that if that's the question you ask of the database, that's the answer you'll get, and they've been QA'd and checked and that sort of thing. They're not final in the sense of being the right endpoint, and that may be that we're a little bit early in that process. But I think you'll find these useful for those order of magnitude calculations and for helping us think about what people eat. So what I've used and what basically everyone is using in the U.S. now is coming from a survey that's part of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's called What We Eat in America. It's this survey, or in some format of this survey, has been done since the 1930s. It's moved from the U.S. Department of Agriculture over to the Center for Health Statistics, which is under CDC. However, the U.S. Department of Agriculture still handles all the things like recipes and constituents and training the interviewers and that sort of thing. So it's a joint effort. The most recent data that are available with all the components we need to do our analyses are 2014. I think it takes more than a single year to have enough individuals to give you some reliability. So I've gone back to 2011 here, and we'll see what that does to give us enough survey respondents in a minute. And this survey is used for lots of important policy data. It's used for looking at nutrition status, nutrient status for the population, and so forth. So the data are really well examined, if you will, and they're examined both by statisticians and by groups of people who are users and wanting the answers. The interviewers are trained. They're asked people in the first instance to recall all the food that was consumed in the previous 24 hours. That is ordinarily an in-person interview because for the NHANES study, they come to a quote in examination trailer for having all those measurements done. And then a second dietary recall is administered by telephone, and that may well migrate to other mechanisms in the next few years. And that's done randomly 3 to 10 days. The goal being to have 2 independent days for as many of the subjects as is possible, and to have them not be on the same day of the week, worrying that people eat differently on Fridays than they do on Mondays and Tuesdays, for example. In that time period I've talked about, we had 15,179 individuals who provided 2 complete datas of dietary recalls. So those are the individuals I've used for this analysis. In that survey, people are asked about what they ate, and if you're interested in the detail of how they do that, that is available on the What We Eat in America website. It results in over 6,000 different food codes. So that's a little bit, the word food is a little ambiguous there. So of those 6,000 food codes, that there might be 25 different pizzas. Cookies are in a lot of detail. I would say that the detail focuses largely on wanting to be able to characterize individuals' nutrient intake, and in particular, how much fat, how much salt, how much vitamin D, so forth. So they're really asking a lot of detail. What I'm now going to do is take those 6,000 codes and bring them back to the commodities that we're interested in. And the list that came to me from I assume from the combination of the Water Board and our science advisor and GSI, are those that are in this chart. There are 16 commodities. I've captured the food consumption of those for all the available food forms. That includes the whole fruit / whole nut, juices, cooked, canned, frozen, and so forth. And to do that, we used the USDA Food and Nutrient Database for dietary studies for those same years. And what that database does is take each of those 6,000 codes and essentially write a recipe for it to characterize it in terms of its ingredients. There's lots of single component foods there, an apple, a pistachio, but there are also, we're a nation that eats mixed dishes. So a lot of these foods are in mixtures that are of interest. Even something like a sugar-coated almond may have a significant amount of sugar there. And the FNDDS provides a recipe for us to use to break those down. For some of them, they end up still with a multi-component commodity. And when that comes up, we use the second USDA database, these food pattern equivalents, which get us to the single ingredients. What we left out of it are those food codes that have less than 1% of the commodity in them. And the reason we did that, and we do that routinely, is these less than 1%, they tend to be flavors or something like that, and they significantly reduce your estimates of the serving size. Because if you're thinking about it in the reverse side and it was a chili flavored almond and you're looking at chili, obviously that's not really a serving of chili. That's an incidental ingredient. And just because of the logistics, we've left baby food out of this as well. The parameters we've used for the estimates I'm going to show you, as I said, are NHANES 2011 through 14. We've used the 2-day average estimates. We've looked at the total U.S. population. And then I've calculated both the mean and the 90th percentile. FDA routinely uses the 90th percentile for all of its analyses. And I think what happens when you get beyond the 90th percentile, particularly when you're looking at the 90th percentile of the users, is you get into the data becomes erratic. I see in that upper part somebody who ate 7 kilograms of beef in one day, for example. So my suspicion is that's why we're going to the 90th percentile. Yeah, exactly. It's most likely a mistake, but they're hard to do that. And I think it's better to be in a reasonable place in what you're doing that you can defend with the data. And then I've also done it in terms of grams per day and in grams per kilogram body weight per day. And the reason I like to do the grams per day, first of all, that's what they use for all the nutrient data, all the Prop 65 data, so we're used to looking at it. But it's helpful for understanding whether these are reasonable serving sizes and are we being conservative, and what does that look like in terms of what we know about people, what people eat. On the next slide, it's the same crops. The first column are the number of people in that survey, number of those 15,000 individuals who reported on at least one day of eating one of the commodities that we're interested in here. And so the smallest is grapefruit, which is about over 200. These are quite healthy numbers of individuals from my experience. The statisticians at the Center for Health Statistics recommend different numbers of individuals for the values you're trying to use. And I've not gone back for this and looked at the 90th percentile, but I think you want to have at least 30 individuals usually for doing those kinds of estimates. So we're well above that here. The second column is the percent of users out of the population. That's just a simple math calculation. And the reason it's also helpful to look at this is if you go to the website and pick up the statistically weighted data that they recommend you use for these analyses, and which I have used here, you can no longer see the number of users because that varies depending on the crop and depending on the category of person who's actually consuming it, but they scale it up to the entire U.S. population. So the numbers look huge, and you can't be tricked into thinking you really had that many respondents, because this is the number of respondents you had.
Dr. Peterson, I have a question about the slide, maybe just a simple clarification, because I see you have citrus, and then you have grapefruit and oranges, which I always considered citrus.
Yes.
You know, and how those groups are defined, because the sum of the lemons and limes and the oranges is greater than the citrus.
Yes, because there are people who eat both. So the citrus is the total for all the crops that are a citrus category, and that category is actually defined ultimately by the Office of Pesticides program at EPA, but I believe it's done for them by the Department of Agriculture. So it's the crop group citrus. But if a person ate a grapefruit and an orange, they would be counted in both categories here.
Thank you.
But that's a good question. And you get especially into that problem when we go over into the 90th percentiles, because you can't add those up because it's not the same individual who's in the 90th percentile for the per capita or for the per user. I could read these out, but I think I won't. I'll just say that these are the numbers you get from the NHANES data, and perhaps we could have a discussion of what we think are the right endpoints, or maybe that should wait until you get a little farther in the tox review. I'm not sure.
Dr. Peterson, what is the red one on the 48 for the citrus?
There was a piece there to do a QA, and I think it just got left red.
Okay.
Sorry. It's not a footnote. It's just left in the ink. Questions?
Bill, can you speak into the microphone, please?
Bill Alio, no carrots on that list. I would hope that'd be there rather than.
I'm sorry, there's a second slide.
That's my-
I never went to it. Here's the rest of the crops. And also in the presentation are the list of references if you want to go back to the website. This is all publicly available data. Though that's a little disingenuous for me to say because it's a fair amount of work to apply the recipes and get back to here. Will?
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. I just want to, unless there's some other discussion, I would like to discuss a little bit about, how we're going to pick these numbers, because I think that's something that it's worth putting out now, some ideas, giving both the public and the panel time to start chewing on this idea and get feedback. One of the things I sort of more of a comment than a question is about this using the 90th percentile, and you brought up a point that I'm not sure might have been clear to everybody about, that in these large data sets there is some erroneous data. It's very hard to clear it out because you just don't know. Did somebody eat, what do you say, 70 kilograms of beef? That would be quite a portion of beef.
I think it was 7, but that's
seven,
still
okay. Even
that's still
seven's a
not
lot,
possible.
But there are those kind of data. So a lot of, when these big data sets like this, a lot of times we do use 90 percentile just to kind of give us a clean out. And then, as I think somebody mentioned about vegetarian diets, to go back and do a second analysis on, or based on this 90 percentile and looking at those numbers, what would be a reasonable diet for somebody who ate nothing but carrots and kale for their diet. So I would welcome to hear some thoughts from you about what you think is what we should do with this, what's the best approach, whether we just stick with the 90th percent or do we do a mean and 90%? How would you proceed?
Hey, this is Ken. Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Please.
So, there's probably, I believe there's, in the literature, there's probably a small database on vegetarian eating practices. So that could be, you could probably estimate that separately, and that could be a separate portion of the high-end analysis.
Well, we actually know who are vegetarians in this database as well, if we wanted to do that. My impression will be, but I'm certainly happy to lay out a couple of tests of my impressions, is that this 90th percentile will capture those people, and we'll see it there.
Yeah, if you could demonstrate that, that would be pretty useful.
We haven't talked, and Rob and Bernie, we haven't talked about what subgroups, if any, if that's something we want to do or we want to stick to the whole population. The problem with getting to subgroups and 90th percentiles of users, you pretty quickly get to small numbers of individuals. It's almost immediately, in fact.
Right, but nonetheless, I think it would be useful information even if you couched it in the increased uncertainty due to the smaller population.
I'm also struck by the first numbers they have in their tables, that even if the consumers in the survey ate 10 times as much, which they surely won't, in my experience, that we're way below your reference doses still.
And that sounds like a reasonable approach to me. For we, do this analysis of the 90 percentile, you look at what the daily consumption, how big a bowl of fruit does that represent? And then looking at the, whatever data is available that says what's the maximum amount a pure vegetarian person might eat, and sort of do a common sense check and say whether do these things start to add up and start to look reasonable.
I think listening to this, I think the level of detail that we want to dig deeper will depend on the size of those ratios. And if we see somebody that's at, that eats 90% of what would be considered maybe a dangerous level of carrots, we'd want to go in and dig into that a little more carefully. For the ones where we've got ratios that are 100 or 1,000 times below, we can probably have some sense of comfort. We don't need to look deeper. But also it struck me as I was looking at that some people are going to eat 3 or 4 of those things every day. And so somehow we need to think, take into account the fact that people are going to be eating, multiple. They're not going to just live on carrots or garlic all day. So we need to take that into account as well.
Well, that's true, particularly in this case, since they're not going to eat them all from the same produced water source, I wouldn't think. So starting to add things up, you probably have to go back to the average to make some sense out of that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The other thing I did hear, which I glossed over, but it's in the headline, is I've used a 2-day average. So I treated each person's data as their data and how much pistachio they ate over that 2-day period. The other way to do that is to treat that as each day as an individual person, if you will, so that they only get concluded for calculating pistachios consumption on the days they ate pistachios. So anybody in that way of doing it, you only count pistachio users as the days they ate them, not even though you know that they ate them on the first day, you don't include them in this analysis. So it's purely arbitrary. It's the standard way it's done for a lot of analyses, but it doesn't mean we have to do it that way.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions, comments? Looking at that, any questions from members of the audience or emails on the phone?
Hi, my name is Barb Sattler. I'm from the University of San Francisco. That was a great presentation. You quickly said that you did not include baby food in these calculations, which Haynes doesn't cover, I don't believe. I'm wondering if there's another database for that, because babies and baby foods, lots of vegetables, lots of fruits are included in that, and they are, from a dose response perspective, they're going to be more sensitive at a lower dose. So I'm just wondering what you might do or have done in calculating that.
Well, Haynes actually does include baby foods, so we could include it, but what it does is it makes your serving sizes much smaller because they don't eat very much. While they're toxicologically perhaps of more concern, certainly, and sensitive, they just don't eat as much. And so the idea here is we're trying to get a worst case estimate of intake, I think. But we could put them back in if people want us to.
Any other questions or comments? Rebecca, any emails? All right. With that, complete item number 5, we'll go on to item number 6, which is the draft paper outline. Basically, I think the only change in the draft white paper outline since the panel last saw it is I included in the introduction the purpose of why we're doing this, because we're actually drafting the introduction as we speak, and I'm actually been reviewing it for the last couple weeks. I had hoped to have it a little further along by this meeting, but I didn't get that done last week. So we will have the introduction portions of this done within the next few weeks probably, and we'll be sending that out to the panel. We can talk about that in more detail at the next one, and certainly we'll start working in concert with GSI and Dr. Stringfellow for water board staff to start drafting some of the other portions with strong input and getting those individual sections ready for the panel review and comment and discussion about that. So I would expect when we have our next meeting, we'll have more discussions to have on that, particularly as GSI gets a little further along and we get task 1 done, we get along on task 2, we get this last group of sampling results that we have from 2018 and get those data assessed, and start to be able to put together all of the fruit sampling. But certainly we'll be drafting issues dealing with the procedures of how the samples were collected and laying out the background as part of the introduction that goes beyond just the discussion of the results. So I would expect that, we'll have a more robust discussion on this item during the next public food safety meeting. But we don't have a whole lot to talk about it now, but we went ahead and put it on the agenda in case any of the panel members or members of the public had any comments or anything they wanted to add while we're still looking at it a little more coarser level. So I would ask if the panel has any comments, let us know, or if you want to ask those questions today, we'll be more than happy to answer that. Pretty short item, I understand, but and not a lot of introduction and probably not a lot of comment to be had. But any comments from the public or any emails over the received on that? Well, that completes the draft paper outline, which takes us, we're going to go ahead and finish before lunch if that's okay with everybody, because I think we're only a few minutes away probably. Do we have any general public questions or comments? Anybody want to add anything about an item that wasn't on the agenda or some general thoughts? We'd be happy to hear that.
Thank you. Bill Alio, Environmental Working Group. I've been here since the beginning of the food safety panel, and we're making progress on doing the analysis we asked for early on. In the beginning, we said if it's proven to be a safe practice, we had no problem with this conjunctive use of recycled water. But we said initially the soil should be tested right away. There seems like there might be a buildup, and the food should be tested right away. That in progress hasn't been done yet. The thing that's disturbing is that the first project I appeared before along with Clean Water Action that was approved, it was done over our objections, and the members of the Regional Water Quality Control Board literally gushed over the project, saying it's a win-win, it's lovely, it's recycling, great. And we're saying not so fast, we don't know if it's safe. And that, I think, led to the creation of the Food Safety Panel, and that's a good thing. But as we're in the second year now or something, we still haven't got, third year, we still haven't got all the soil samples done, and we're in progress for the rest. But there was a new application for yet another project of oil wastewater to agriculture, and that's the Sherwood Hills project, which was on the agenda for December and pulled off. We hope it stays off for a long time. We just think it's inappropriate to have these applications come in and then routinely approved when we haven't got good answers from the food safety panel yet. Again, if everything was done and said it looks safe, we'd say go for it, who cares? It is a good use of recycled water, so to speak, and is a good conjunctive use. But we're not there yet. So we like to see that Sherwood Hills project stay off the agenda until the work of this panel is done, and that a consensus, if not a good majority of the panel, says we're okay with the practice. And one aspect of that Sherwood Hills project is it says what the water will be used for. It'll be used for trees, orchards, groundwater recharge, et cetera. It never mentions root crops, things grown in the ground. And I don't know if that's the truth. We don't know. They could switch it 2 years from now or 5 years from now. They're saying this is what we think the water will be used for. But that shouldn't be any part of the consideration by the regional board. We should assume it could be used for ground crops. And I'm going to bring us back to the last meeting of the food safety panel when Dr. Banuelos, I think his name was here, a soil scientist, and it was much welcome to have an expert on the uptake of metals and other constituents into plants. And here he was speaking for over an hour. There were some questions in the food safety panel, but I want to take us to the point where I got up and asked him about uptake, and I think I said, it sounds like it's difficult to end up with chemicals or heavy metals in an almond, that heavy woody plants don't uptake this stuff as much, except for certain kinds that he's experimenting on in the Middle East and other places. But then I asked him about, what about root crops? And he said, point blank, I would not grow tubers or other root crops in this soil. Now, he didn't say until the food safety panel said it's clear, but in his knowledge, his expertise is on exactly what this food safety panel is supposed to do. And he said, I wouldn't do it. And here we are with another proposal to do it again. Coelho's still going, North Kern's still going. It seems kind of unbelievable to me that finally we have an expert saying, don't do it, I wouldn't do it, and nothing has changed. So what could change is yet another project being approved. I don't think you're going to pull the permits for Chevron to Coelho and CRC to North Kern. We think you should. We asked for that long ago. But I guess that completes my comments, is I'm glad to have the science and the money being spent and acquired from various sources, including I applaud the users and suppliers for putting forth funds to get this done. And when I started working on this 3 years ago, I couldn't find much in the literature. I just Googled it nationally. There's very little done. So it was really interesting to have Dr. Banuelos up here talking about it, who actually works on this issue. So I'll complete my comments there, and I just hope the regional board, in making decisions, allows this food safety panel to continue to come to some conclusions and doesn't approve any more projects until that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments or questions? With that, I guess we have action items and next steps. Rebecca, you got a list? We committed to any action items? I know we're going to talk about the white paper in much more detail next time, and task 3, the fruit sampling, during the next meeting.
Yeah, just posting the materials from the meeting today, getting the summaries out to the panel. Well, they have the summaries, but getting responses from the panel and getting those posted. That's all I have.
In addition, staff and then the panel will be reviewing the draft GSI report. So we'll get that out to the panel, and then we'll incorporate those, address and incorporate comments. And then when GSI gets that finalized, we will get that up on the website for everybody to review. I'm assuming we should have that before the next public meeting. And next steps would be is that, I would anticipate, we have not set a date yet, have we, Dale? But we'll be working on a date. I would guess that here we are, the middle of January to the end of January. We're probably looking at the end of April, early May, something in that time frame, and we'll work with the panel to come up with an appropriate date to maximize the ability to participate in the meeting. So, and we'll get that up on the web page. Certainly, there'll be notices that are sent out, and we will do our best to get information out and available before the meeting so people have a chance to review and comment, things like the GSI report and whatnot, so that we can all participate in a broad and open discussion where people have a chance to review it. I'm not a huge fan. I walk in, people hand me a report and ask me what I think in a meeting, and it doesn't always work that well. So we'll do our best to try and avoid that. Yes, Rebecca.
So we did get one more question from the email list.
Okay.
This question comes from Justin Bass. He says, he has two questions. Number one, please ask the woman on the food safety panel to identify herself again. How did she and how do the scientists on the food safety panel test toxicity levels in the human test subjects? Blood and urine samples, for example, stool samples? Question mark. And then his second question is, who on the food safety panel eats food grown with oil-filled wastewater? Thank you.
Barbara, would you like to answer that question?
I guess I could certainly answer my name, which is Barbara Peterson, and I did the consumption estimates. I've not done any work on human levels or blood testing or anything like that. That's beyond what I understand.
Any
And
of
his
the
last
other-
question was, do we eat it? And I suspect we do.
Yes, Bill.
Dr. Peterson, maybe you should let her know who you're associated with, the woman asked the question.
I work for Exponent Incorporated. We're a consulting firm, and we do, in my case here, what I'm doing is food consumption modeling and parameters.
From where I stand, it's Bill Alley again, I think she's maybe one of the most qualified people on the panel to look at this issue from her background. I was going to say I eat food from this, or I have eaten food from these fields. Grimway Farms, largest producer of organic carrots in the United States, I believe, certainly in California. Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op sourced their carrots from them for years and years and years. They still do. They produce Cal Organics brand, which is sold at Costco in large bags. They produce Bunny Love carrots, the little small ones in bags. So I think many of us have eaten food from there. One of the members of the food panel early on said, well, no one eats crops in the same field all year. We'll assume that. Well, if you eat carrots every day from the Natural Foods Co-op, you were. It's my understanding that Grimway Farms has ceased using the produced water from Coelho and is, I think, using groundwater now, maybe State Water Project water. I tried to find out why, but it's not easy to find out why they switched sources of water.
Thank you.
This is Gabrielle. I just want to comment on that comment just now. And carrots are grown throughout, depending on the season, they're grown throughout the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. In the winter months, they move to the coast or the desert. Some of them are even sourced from Colorado. And currently, the oil-produced water is only applied to a small percentage of the acreage within Kern County. So I just wanted to say that I would say, yes, we've probably, if we're eating some of the food from Kern County, we may have been exposed, but also remember it's not like all of the food grown in Kern County is using this water.
And I would add that, this is not a large amount of the acreage in Kern County. I don't have the numbers on hand. I do know in the southern San Joaquin Valley from the San Joaquin River south, there's about between 3 and 4 million acres of irrigated lands. And what we're talking about here, I believe, is, you can speak, Dale.
I think it's about 100,000 acres are currently permitted.
Yeah, there's about 100,000 acres that is permitted to receive this water. Not all of that land receives water, and most of it undergoes significant dilution before it's actually used. So, you know, and particularly like the carrots, we're talking about a couple hundred acres of carrots in Kern County that have in the past at times been grown with produced water versus a crop that is significant acreage within Kern County, probably, you know, probably in the tens of thousands of acres are grown per year by some of the producers. So, you know, that one large producer may produce a particular source, but even if they grow an acreage, I mean, it's probably, you know, a very small percentage of their crop that probably sees produced water. I just wanted to add that as a little bit of a caveat.
Just quickly looking at the 2018 crop surveys that we have, there's about 500 acres of carrots between Coelho and North Kern Water Storage District.
Okay, a little bit more than the 200 to 300, but you know, I don't know exactly how many acres are grown in Kern County, but it is a significant crop in Kern County. Does Mr. Bass have any other questions, Rebecca, that he's emailed to us?
Not at this
Or
time.
any follow-up?
No, I don't. Not that I see.
Okay. Well, certainly, I think we've made it through the agenda. We certainly appreciate everybody's participation, appreciate the panel's participation particularly. I want to thank you all for coming, and please have a safe trip going home. We'll see you soon. Thanks.